Which part?
The TransAdvocate part. Nope, nothing.
Hey, if there's nothing, there's nothing.
No updates.
This is Cristan Williams, and you're listening to the TransAdvocate podcast. Today we have the regular crew, which is
Robin, Mack,
and Alexis.
And we also have Koomah.
Hi.
Yeah. Koomah is going to be talking about what's going on here in Houston with the intersex community and a couple of things that has been going on that's pretty remarkable here in Texas with the intersex community and intersex activism. But before we get to that, we wanted to talk about some just general housekeeping stuff, things that are coming up. I know that we have HTGA every, Monday?
Every Monday night.
That's right, 7:30, yeah?
Yes, and then they go out to Empire Cafe for
Empire, we're looking for a sponsorship.
Come on, Empire.
You know, Robin sometimes seems to forget about the HTGA meeting, but never the cake afterwards.
Right.
Yeah, that whole meeting thing, but the cake is delicious.
Okay, and we have the Unity Banquet coming up?
You know,
we do.
25th anniversary. It's a big deal.
Have some really
we've been
cool
doing this for 25 years.
We haven't, fortunately.
Right.
Well, maybe we have if we put everyone together thinking about this. But yeah, it's on the 4th of November. It's a Saturday. We still have some tickets available, but not a whole lot. In fact, we have less than I thought we had available once I went and put everything together to make sure we knew who all were coming and all that type stuff. So if you want a ticket, unitybanquet.com, best place to go.
Okay.
Yeah, sooner than later.
Right. Because I think that tends to sell out every single year that I know of, yeah. It's like pretty awesome to have like several hundred people in one room to talk about, you know, all kinds of trans expressions, and you've got Texas politicians in the room. You know, it's a very interesting thing. I remember whenever Kate Bornstein came down, she was like, going to teach us about, you know, how to be trans.
Like, oh, we might know a thing or two about that.
And how to be inclusive.
I love how, like, in the middle of it, she started reading the banner project. Like, oh, wait, those people are in the room.
But she had a really good time.
Yeah,
It was
her
amazing.
talk was
But
awesome.
as she started working with the crowd, she was like, well, back in, wait a minute, Cristan, what year was this in? That was great.
Okay, so that's November the 4th?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And one thing with the Unity Banquet is that we pretty much let some of the people who've been around for a long time speak if they want to. We have several people that have asked to speak. We have no clue what they're going to say or talk about. And we also know there's no way to control them. So it's usually interesting.
Right. And then we have Day of Remembrance coming up.
Day of Remembrance is going to be on a Saturday at U of H campus, November 18th. So it's just right around the corner. If you want to help set up, it's at 6. The actual programming will start at 7.
Okay. And coming right up is Intersex Awareness Day, yeah?
Right.
Yes.
Okay, well...
That's actually tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow. And
It's
what is
tomorrow.
tomorrow? What day?
The 26th.
Yay! Okay, so the 26th, is it always on the 26th?
Yes.
October
Always
26th.
on October 26th.
So how did this day come to be?
So, several years ago in, I believe it was 1996, which may or may not be accurate, but around that time, I'm trying.
No fact checking,
Please do fact check
Or
that.
just
That
let
would
us
be
know.
great to have the actual year, because my brain is mush right now. Anyway, yes, so in the 90s, we'll say mid-90s, there was a protest in Boston at a annual pediatrics conference. So there was a group that called themselves Hermaphrodites with Attitude.
That's right.
And they organized a protest of this event because there were many surgeons that were doing non-consensual, basically what we call in our community infant genital mutilation surgeries. So, quote unquote, normalizing surgeries on intersex infants. So they did a protest, and they were supported by another group called the Transsexual Menace.
Right.
So that is very, very unique to our history and to the history of both the intersex and the trans groups in our history of really working together. And this was our springboard moment. This, at least in the U.S., was that moment where our community, the intersex community, was no longer afraid to stand up and speak out and to be visible. So that was on October 26th, and many of our intersex elders were actually participants in that.
Right. And so tomorrow, I understand there's going to be a type of a ceremony going on down at City Hall. Is that correct?
Well, the ceremony is actually on the 25th.
Okay.
And that is the illumination of Houston City Hall.
I see.
Will that be this evening?
Yeah, well, yes, that is this evening.
As in this 25th?
As in later tonight.
Oh my God. So I understand that that's kind of historic.
It is. So this is our third illumination. Our very first one was in 2015. And as far as we know, we were the first city to ever have a government building illuminated in honor of Intersex Awareness Day. So I've actually found out that this year in Australia, there's a bridge that is being illuminated for Intersex Awareness Day. Wow. So I feel like we started a trend. And
Houston,
wait a minute, Houston, Texas.
That's right.
Did that?
Right, and I want to say that that's not the only thing that you guys have been doing. I understand that in this last legislative session, you were actually able to put together a bill and have it submitted to the Texas legislature.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. So SB 1342 was a bill that would prevent medically unnecessary normalization, again, normalization in quotes, surgeries on intersex minors in state care. And we were aided by Interact and some other intersex organizations and groups with lots of input. The bill was sponsored by Sylvia Garcia. It was a lot of work and a lot of talking and writing and rewriting and.
Yeah, but I would say that has to be the first intersex bill that's ever been considered in Texas.
Yes.
That's pretty amazing, and I think that it's pretty amazing that you guys were able to do that.
So from what we understand, there was one bill a year or two before ours directly related to the MC case that was put together by surprisingly like a pretty conservative Republican politician in another state. And it didn't really get very far, but he was not intersex. It was based solely on this story that he had heard. So we did our bill, and about a week after our bill was filed, there was another bill in Nevada that had a segment relating to intersex folks that was also created by intersex people. So that bill was a little bit different because it was a section of a much larger bill in regards to things that doctors should and shouldn't do, and their bill actually would have had like repercussions, punishments for doctors that would do non-consensual genital surgeries. But their bill died in session, I think, and well, so did ours. So, but it's still first. Well, we got farther than we ever expected. And
I'm just a bill that died in session. Yeah.
Yeah.
How far did the bill get?
I don't know.
I'm seeing a really blank look. It got into committee, assigned by a committee, and heard in a committee.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
You know, and the Texas Senate is not friendly to the LGBTQI, etc. World, and so it's surprising they even got to committee, let alone heard in committee. But it did. Typically, what you find is right now with the Texas Senate, it'll be a 22-11 vote, plus or minus one.
Right.
and then it goes over to the House, and they actually do all the work and decide things. I think Senator Garcia also mentioned, and so did a couple of the people in the House, that typically it takes 3 terms to get a bill through. If it gets anywhere in the first term, that's a good thing, and then the second term, they have a chance of maybe getting it a little further, but usually it takes 3 terms to do it. So it'll be around for a while.
Right. We did not expect it to pass on first try. But the fact that the bill was even created was historic for us. So hopefully in the future, with some more work, we will see something either as the bill was originally written or maybe in a different format, but we will see something happen.
So your intention is to have it resubmitted?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, and I wonder for people that don't know a lot about the process, how many hours would you say you already put into this? Like as a society,
every day,
you guys
every
do a lot.
day. So I'm the co-founder of the Houston Intersex Society, and the other co-founder rents a room from me. So every day we talk about this stuff every day.
Like after coffee.
Like while we are cleaning and washing dishes.
While you're caking.
Yeah, like flipping through channels. Like it's always in discussion. The discussion never ceases.
And working up to the legislative session and getting the bill submitted, how much time did that take, or how long?
I don't even know how to answer that. Something that I never kept track of.
I think the first hope of getting it submitted was probably in December or January at the Legislative Forum, when it got a good hearing from Senator Garcia, shall we say, and several other people on the panel. And then it was submitted probably 4 months after that, I think. Maybe 5.
And that was what the political caucus did, right?
The forum was what the political caucus did. There was a legislative forum that we did. So, I mean, it takes some time and effort, and then it'll take more time and effort, and more time and effort, and then you have to go testify.
What is your experience with the intersex community here in Houston? Yeah, I would, now we actually have an intersex group. Now we actually have intersex political action. That's not always been the case. Whenever my first trans meeting was run by a straight drag queen, an intersex person who also identified as a trans woman, and a transsexual. So, like, my first experience
face afterwards, and like, what?
My
Sounds
first
about
experience
right.
of Houston's community was just diverse, and it's always been that way. So, but my experience of the intersex community has always been wrapped up in the trans community. And like I said, we now have an intersex group, intersex specific policy. How did that come to be?
Goodness. So at least for the formation of the intersex group, it started by me and the other co-founder reconnecting. We had been we knew each other as teenagers, and we had gone to the same youth group.
Oh, really?
For every Friday night for years. Sat next to each other sometimes. Didn't know the other was intersex.
Wow.
And at that time, we both felt like we were the only intersex person on the face of the earth. Like, we were both convinced that we would never meet another person like us, like ourselves. And I'm an artist, and I do a lot of performance. I had done a performance related to being intersex, and one of his friends had shared it, and he saw it, and he contacted me and messaged me, and I was like, oh, I'm at the TG Center. And he was like, stay there, I'm coming over. So we reconnected, and like that day, we were like, we're going to start a group because nobody else should feel that way. Right. People need to know that there are other people there. So when we started the group, that was, goodness, Goodness, I don't even know. Do you remember when it was?
Let's see.
I started teaching yoga there at
2012?
That could have been 2012 because I started teaching yoga there in 2009. So 2009 was when we were just about to leave Fargo and go to Pacific.
Yeah, and it was at Pacific, so probably like 2012.
Yeah.
Wow.
Goodness.
It's been a minute.
Well, so when we started the group, our intention was to be like a social and support group and have a meeting every week. And we quickly found out that the needs of our community was not necessarily that it was something different. And my experience was that I would have a lot of people contact me and then like tell me their whole life story and then say, but I don't want to be a part of a group. I just want to live my life. I just want to be this or that or do whatever. So we focused more on education and outreach, doing a lot of panels, speaking at universities, magazine interviews, things like that, but still also creating social events that are community events. So movie screenings and because I am an artist, like I do a lot of arts oriented work. So having arts and performance education through that.
You have something coming up that is combining the two, right? Are you having
yes.
a film about intersex?
Yes, so I also work with Gender Real Houston, which is a trans and gender diverse film festival. And we have an event on Sunday the 29th, which is a screening of the movie Both by Lisette Barcellos. And that film is one of the few intersex-themed films made by an intersex person that I could find. That is not a documentary. It's actually a narrative. So.
And then can you say the time and if there's a cost for people who are interested?
Sure. So the screening is October 29th. That is a Sunday at 2 p.m. at 14 Pews. That is 800 Aurora Street. And it is pay what you can.
Gotcha.
Nice.
So all of you rich people out there, bring money. Lots and lots of money.
Lots of money.
Yeah. And haven't you and Mo had Intersex Awareness days that people have attended? I mean, I remember at Frenetic there has been a timeline where you present films by Interact, and I mean you kind of make a day of it, right?
Yes. So in the past we've done like one day where we have programming. This year we've been trying to do an entire week full of programming, so more spread out. So Monday there was a little blurb on queer voices. And yesterday we did a small live streamed event from Microspace Houston that was music and spoken word. And then we also, we took questions from anybody that wanted to ask us a question anonymously. We used the app Saraha? I don't know, or Saraha? I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
I'm old, so I don't know.
It was an app that was like trending a while back.
How'd that go?
It went really well. We got a lot of really good questions. We didn't get any like trolling questions. They all seemed really sincere. My favorite question though was someone asked, they basically said, I'm a cis man, like a white cis man, and I'm attracted to non-normative, non-binary bodies. Does this make me a fetishist? And I was really not expecting so in-depth questions. So it was really, there were some questions that brought up some really interesting conversation. There was another question about like reparations and how we felt about that. So I was kind of expecting like, what's the difference between trans and intersex? And like, and we ended up getting some that caught us really off guard. There were a lot of really, really good questions.
Which, by the way, is what I seem to be asked in just about every talk I give. What is intersex? So what is intersex?
Intersex is when someone is born with anatomy or chromosomes, usually it's internal or external genitalia and gonads, that are somewhere in between what is considered standard for male or female. So the old word for that was hermaphrodite, but we typically don't use that word because it's really misleading, and it insinuates that someone has both sets of fully functioning reproductive organs, which doesn't really happen in people. As far as medical diagnoses, there are over 30 different recognized diagnoses of intersex, but there's also several folks that don't get diagnoses that know that they are intersex. There's typically, they say that the estimates are about 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000, which is about the same number of people that have red hair or green eyes, about the same number of twins. So that number also is specific to people who are born intersex that have notable anatomy, notable intersex traits at birth. And so sometimes people don't find out that they're intersex until they don't start puberty or until they have fertility issues. So the number is really just kind of an estimate. We don't really know what that number is, but it's basically being born with a body that is not typical of medically understood male or female.
So I've heard a different term other than intersex and the older term hermaphrodite, and that is disorders of interest. What is it? Disorders of sexual development.
Yes.
All right. So how do you feel about this disordered label?
So personally, I don't like it. I don't feel like I'm disordered. I feel like I have a natural variation. There are other people that prefer the label DSD because they consider themselves, usually the folks that embrace the DSD label have a binary gender identity, and so they feel like they are a woman or a man that has a disorder that makes their body different. So they prefer to view their experience from this medicalized way.
And I've heard some people try to kind of bridge that gap by using the term differences of sexual development. Is that a term that's generally used or accepted?
So that term is sometimes used by folks. It's difficult though, because I mean it's called DSD. And so then it's up to personal interpretation of whether you're going to allow that first D to be disordered or difference.
Gotcha.
But when I hear it, it's disordered.
Yeah.
And it's very strange because, so like with WPATH, it was like, you know, when they focused on trans issues, it was like, we're moving away from gender identity disorder. We're not disordered. But they still advocated for like DSD language, which is very confusing to me. And I don't view my body as disordered. It is different, but I can't hear DSD and not hear disordered, because it is medicalized language, and that medicalized anything really is going to view me as an other, whether that's disordered or whether that's different. Instead of saying, I have a natural variation or I have intersex traits, it's different or disordered.
And so can you talk, and I've not really seen this actually in real life, like, especially in our community, but there seems to be some tension between the intersex community and the trans community. At least I've seen online. I've seen that talked, you know, and that's generally around. I've you know, seen people go, oh, I'm intersex. I'm not really trans. I'm intersex. So, you know, that kind of narrative. Can you talk about, you know, how is that for you as an intersex person to come across people who either, you know, oh, I'm not really trans, I'm not, you know, I'm really, you know, intersex, and so I really have to transition. Do you see those narratives play out? If so, how do you deal with them? Is that an issue, you know, at least online? Do you see that talked about?
Yes, and it is both frustrating and heartbreaking at the same time. It's frustrating because when that happens, a lot of times those individuals are giving misinformation about intersex.
Right.
It is heartbreaking because intersex is then, number one, trivialized. Like the abuses that we face, medical abuses and all this other stuff, is trivialized or erased because there's this assumption that intersex is super easy.
Right.
But it's also heartbreaking because when people do that, they're trying to justify being trans. And they're telling themselves that there's something wrong with being trans.
Right.
And there's not. Like, if you're trans, you're trans. If you're intersex, you're intersex. Sometimes people are both. Like, I identify as both. But it's really heartbreaking because it's this internalized transphobia that is becoming outward. And it's damaging to the intersex community because it confuses other people when we're trying to tell our stories. And we have these other stories that are not similar to our experiences, or they come along with misinformation, especially when those folks try to act as educators about intersex issues and intersex experiences. But then it also creates some tension because there are folks in the intersex community who are either trans ignorant or transphobic. Like, that sometimes happens too. And so there can be this really difficult kind of space where we have folks that are claiming that all trans people are intersex. The idea of like brain intersex.
Oh, right.
Or when trans folks will try to use intersex as a justification of their being trans. And so it always kind of falls back to this concept of, or this belief that intersex is real and trans is not. Or that trans is like a psychological disorder or something, and intersex is something that you can see and therefore it's more valid. And it's not. They're just different. And that's the big thing that I try to really explain in both communities. Like, as someone who's intersex that's part of the trans community, it's this constant kind of reminder of intersex is not easy. Like, these are all these horror stories that I've come up against because of being intersex and because of having an intersex body. Even as an adult, like, I can't access the same kind of medical care that trans people can get. Or I have a more difficult time accessing certain types of care. And so reminding people, like, no, intersex is not easier. It's not this fun, like, oh, it's super cool. Like, it comes with its own issues. And also that there is nothing wrong with being trans. Intersex is not more valid than trans is. They're both valid. They're just different experiences.
Gotcha. And I wanted to just kind of... So some of this stuff, I see the discourse, it's different in actual real life and then online. Online, I see some I would call them sex essentialist activists, people who believe that either God or capital N nature created man and woman, and that everything else is aberrant in some way. Now, that could be because they have a theological position or an ideological position, but for some reason, out of this ideology, they believe that there are these two things, and anything else is aberrant. So if you're trans, you're aberrant, you're non-natural. Let's see, Janice Raymond made that claim in her book, Transsexual Empire, that we're non-natural, that we're synthetic products, those kinds of things. And some of the toxic narrative that I see directed at intersex people from those sex essentialists is that, intersex people, they're really one or the other, and there's no in between. How do you deal with those kinds of assertions?
Oh, goodness. For me, that's a lot harder because I don't identify as one or the other. There are some intersex people who do have a binary gender orientation or gender identity. There's also a lot of us that are non-binary or gender fluid or bigender or whatever. So I try to avoid spaces where
people are being assholes.
I didn't say it. You said it. But
and one of the big problems is that when you really get down to it, anything binary is unnatural. It simply does not occur naturally in nature. You can't find any situation where there is something that occurs only as a binary with no little edge versions of it or nuances or anything else. So, by definition, the naturalists with the capital N are unnatural.
And this is really reminding me. I'm so grateful to hear your story now in 2017 because, in 2010 when we were writing the gender book and we were putting our very first illustration out on the internet as to what we're going to do, we presented the transgender umbrella.
Oh, the umbrella.
And,
claimed by half the people in the world and denied by the other half.
Exactly, right? And we had intersex under the umbrella, under the transgender umbrella, because we knew Koomah.
Right.
And Koomah is both, And I just love your story about how you and Mo grew up and didn't know you sit next to each other and you're both intersex. Like, you didn't know because people don't necessarily wear it on their sleeve, right? And so we weren't super familiar as the writers of the gender book of all the nuances of each identity under the umbrella. We were just doing the 101, right? So we put this illustration on the internet. We had just had our website put up, and it was the first illustration we put up there. And we went to sleep, and within 24 hours, it was crazy. Within 24 hours, we woke up, and something like the Institution of Intersex Somethingness in Australia wrote us a very formal letter saying, please immediately take this image down. And I kind of get the feeling it was, probably a hater group that was writing this, not a legit organization, because when we went to go try to Google it, see where this organization was, who's writing us, we couldn't really find anything. Oh. But it was a very formal letter saying that in Australia, they had intersex rights established for people to have surgeries, and they don't associate themselves with transgender people because transgender people are associated with the gays and the lesbians, and they wouldn't be able to get their surgeries if they were associated with the sexuality umbrella. So it's just bringing all this back to my mind. We started off with current issues, but even in 2010, within 24 hours, you're talking about those, how do you tell what's happening in real life versus internet stuff? Right. Mm-hmm. It occurred as if it was really real, and the way this letter read was like we're going to take action if you don't alter this image. And so here we were, just a gaggle of people that were willing to put out a 101 book, and we weren't going to get too heady about it. We were like, okay, well, since this is an institution and they're very serious, we didn't even take time to do much research, but we decided that, okay, well, we actually do know someone who identifies as transgender and who is also intersex. So what we're going to do is give them their rightfully deserved own page. Right. And this is a topic that deserves so much spotlight because we don't know so much about it, right? But in current times, Koomah, I wonder in 2017, do you find that there's still that war of, if you were just normalized, like what Alexis was saying, and what Cristan was saying, if you were just normalized and all you had to have was just some surgeries because you are the binary, then maybe policies would get passed faster, in some countries, if you weren't associated with the gays and the lesbians, do you feel like that's happening in America? Because, I mean, in 2017, you can kind of see a little flavor of that.
Well,
right.
I think in America, at least.
America. Down here in the South.
Yeah.
I feel like there's enough embracing of non-binary identities and gender orientations and various different sexualities that you can't really expect or request the folks within the intersex community who have like non-binary identities or identify as, you know, LGB or, you know, whatever, or identify as trans, to hide that for the benefit of everybody else. There was an article that was put out very recently about 2 intersex individuals in Russia and how a lot of the intersex groups there do try to separate from like LGBT for safety, because it is such a safety issue.
Rounded up and put in prisons and killed.
So, but that is such a radically different experience than like the American experience.
Right.
But you know, looking back too, like I think having the 2-page spread in the gender book really was for the best. I mean,
Sure. Me too.
there are definitely intersex folks that identify as trans, and there are definitely intersex folks that don't identify as trans. So to have it under the trans umbrella is difficult, and it's kind of the same thing of like when we include the I in LGBTQI plus. You know, some people do and some people don't. So it's one of those things that there are some people within the intersex community that intentionally will write that out with like a lowercase I to kind of start that discussion, because it, like, our community is so diverse and varied just within the intersex community, and I've met the most like very, very binary, conservative, straight intersex people. There are people that are similar to me that are very like out there and queer, super queer, and you know, all of these
really
other things.
Its own spectrum.
It is its own spectrum.
But isn't that the same for everyone? I mean, I know trans people who are like, oh, don't call me, I'm not trans, I'm not, you know, I'm a transsexual, and I don't associate me with those nasty people over there. I'm normal, you know, that kind
even
of.
Like cis people have a spectrum. Like there's the geek, the jerk, you know, the awesomeness, you know,
So back to the assholes. There are assholes in every community.
The movement has an asshole.
It's the manly man bit, too, you know?
Yes, the manly man, the femme man, yes.
Yeah, it occurs to me that this is going to get more complicated.
Always does.
Of course, it never gets simpler for some reason.
There's space for it all. When
Two or three months ago, Scientific American published an article about the physical markers that they're finding for transgender identities. And there are quite a few. So by definition, if I have a physical difference and it falls in there, then I start to get into does that make me suddenly intersexed or not?
Lord.
And who knows, you know?
Well, there's that whole spectrum. Like there's Koomah, you had talked about the whole so-called brain sex thing, and I think whenever, I mean, to use this shitty academic speak, ontology, that's what we're talking about. What does it mean to be something? What does it mean to be trans? What does it mean to be intersex? What does it mean to be man and woman? You know, what goes into that, you know, succinctly, you know, and not in between, but it contains only this. And it reminds me of a criticism that an American radical feminist named Ruth Hirschberger made in the 1940s. She was writing about how it sucks for women. Part of the oppression that women face is we grew up with these idealized bodies. You know, you see them in textbooks and stuff. There's the manly man with the broad shoulders, and they're, you know, 12 foot tall, and then there's the womanly woman, super wide hips and huge breasts, and, you know, all this other stuff.
Even
and
Playboys like Photoshop.
Yes, exactly. Well, exactly. That those ideals of what we call man and woman, that those are constructs, and that most people do not fall into those binaries. You know, there are women with wide shoulders. There are, there's all of these physical traits that do not perfectly match up. And that's something, well, yeah, and that's something that women deal with on a daily basis, going through makeup and hair and I guess corsets at the time. Absolutely. And all of that stuff to try to make their physical body match this fake idea.
And they're bringing a lot of that back, like the waist trimmers and things like that. People, they're advertised as working out with them, but people wear them all day long.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing is that if it seems that society starts to become accustomed to one of the styles, which is what it really is, we change the style. we change what's perfect. I mean, there was a period of time when extremely narrow hips and no breasts for women were the absolute perfect look. And of course,
hair's coming back,
and the people who essentially had the look a few years before that were really in trouble because it was wide hips and big breasts. And so then about the time that everyone got so skinny that they were about to die, we changed it again.
Right. What did they call that? Heroin chic?
No. Yes.
Right.
And then, and it's not quite as radical for men, but it really is. If you start looking at some of the things, it's like a different look. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, I mean, a really large, fat stomach was really in style because that showed you had money to...
Let's bring it back.
No!
For the intersex community, whenever we get to talking, naturally... talking about differences of sexual development, intersex bodies will generally lead somewhere to talking about these idealized notions of what male and female is, because you're talking about bodies and what these bodies mean and what are they categorized at. How does the intersex community, how does your group work with facilitating those conversations in a way that isn't disrespectful? If there's someone busting into an intersex space talking about I'm really intersex and you must accept me because whatever, I mean, how does that work?
A lot of times I think the discomfort of our conversations about the experiences that we have as intersex people usually kind of slowly pushes those individuals out.
Let's jump.
Which is, I mean,
the bigger hair girl.
And it is a very real thing, right? Like, so with intersex, it all kind of boils down to genitals, gonads, chromosomes, and the otherness, like the treatment that we receive because of those traits.
Right.
And it kind of goes back to reminding folks, like, it's not this like super happy, oh, we're better than you because we're this. It's not. It's we have received horrific treatment because of this. Some of us are trying to transition to a binary gender. Some of us are non-binary. For some folks, that's where they come into trans spaces. And so when we do have those conversations of, this was my experience of being sedated and strapped to a board when I was 7 and have doctors, probe my genitals and take photos of me, suddenly it's not as validating to make those claims anymore. And we've seen people come into these groups and then just never come back because they don't have that shared experience. And it suddenly becomes very real that, like, this is not easier than being trans. It's not more valid or anything like that. It's just different. And it is really unfortunate too. Like, we're trying very, very hard to prevent those experiences from happening in other intersex young people.
Right.
And provide the support that we need for other intersex folks that have experienced that trauma to get through that. For the intersex community as a whole, like, our goal is to have a future where those conversations aren't being had by our our intersex youth as they grow up, and we are seeing where there are more intersex young people who are intact, where their bodies are not surgically altered, and their parents are advocating for them and making sure that they're treated with respect. But they still are involved enough to know that it still happens to other people, so they still have those discussions with us as well.
And I just wonder, if you're saying there's the same amount of intersex people as there are redheads and people with green eyes, but at the same time, what has you be under that category, if you will, is so vastly different, from gonads to chromosomes. If you were able to find people that labeled themselves intersex that were having an experience of that, I could just imagine that even in a support group, everyone could rightfully have their really own unique expression of that. Like, how do you guys find commonality? How do you find that support? Because being strapped to a board may be very different than somebody who has just different secondary sex chromosomes later on during the years, right?
Right. For me, I think that experience, so there's a AISDSD conference that happens. There's a conference that happens every year. The next one will be in Chicago. And that is an incredibly diverse group of intersex folks of all different experiences that kind of come together. And so we do see, with different workshops and stuff like that, those different experiences. But it's, I don't know. It's hard to explain.
No. I just recalled this. You were telling me that you were giving this talk as an intersex person who's trans, and some drunken person burst into the room to correct you on.
Oh God.
And yeah.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. My favorite is I had a trans community person tell me that I could not call myself a hermaphrodite.
Oh, okay.
So, but it's like a reclaimed term, right? So, yes, I can call myself this. Please don't call someone else that.
Right.
And so, for people who are listening and they're finally finding community or want more resources, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, they can find us on Facebook at the Houston Intersex Society.
And then we have a page on our tfahouston.com. You guys are listed as a group, the Intersex Society support group, if people wanted to donate towards your group.
Yes.
Do you have your own individual website, or just that's the contact point?
That is the best contact point. I think there is a WordPress site out there somewhere that has not been updated in a long time.
No worries, not to call you
so,
out. You've been busy. But
if you've been listening to this podcast, you will understand that we've been incredibly busy writing bills and doing film festivals.
So one more time with the conference. In case they wanted to go to that conference.
That is the AISDSD conference. It's a yearly conference. There's also the AISDSD support group, which is a national support group. And there's various different organizations.
What about
as well.
that? Oh,
That is Organization Intersex International. There are ones for representing different countries. So there's a North American one. There's an Australian one. Mm-hmm. There's also Interact, which is specific to intersex youth and young adults.
And is there any one country or culture that's really rocking it in support for the intersex community?
Houston, Texas.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. You heard it here.
I had to ask.
Once again, one of those Houston isn't like Texas things.
That's right.
What does Rachel Maddow say? It's Houston. It's Houston.
Oh, okay. Well, is there anything else that y'all wanted to say before we close?
No, I think Community Banquet, DOR, the gender real screening this weekend. That's a lot of things going on.
Yeah. I would encourage folks to check out intersexday.org to learn more. There's an about section where you can learn more of the story about the protest in Boston that happened from folks that were actually there. There's also various different articles written by different intersex people from all over. So there's photos of what people are doing in different areas as well.
And will there be anyone down at City Hall this evening?
There will. I will be there, and so will Mo. We'll be live streaming, so if you can't get down there, if you check out the Houston Intersex Society Facebook page, we'll be streaming our faces with City Hall lit up yellow and purple behind us, where we just like smile and look awkwardly into the camera.
Tune in, so you can rewatch.
I don't know how long we can stand there and just
I want
smile.
at least 3 hours. Come on. I mean, till the arm goes numb and you faint.
Well, you know, I say that, but like the thing that we did yesterday, we were like, oh, we'll do this for like 30 minutes. I think our live stream ended up being like 3 hours long.
It got dark pretty fast yesterday, so this might be quick.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, thank you, Koomah, for joining us today. Thank you for coming out, and we'll catch you next time.
Is there anything you want to say about TransAdvocate updates?
No.
Okay, no.
The TransAdvocate still is around.
We'll just edit that out. We'll edit it out.
And I think we're gonna, try to keep the podcast going on a weekly basis.
Not exactly sure what we're going to talk about, but we never are.
That's right. All right. Tune in next time.